So continuing with fixed and variable cost, I wanted to go over an example of office space that is available at a rent at a rate of 40,000 per year in increments of 3,000 square feet. And as the business grows, more space is rented, increasing the total cost. So if we look here, there is a situation where we can see that um, as this is for the company that produces boats that we looked to in the past, as they every increment that they increase, they stay at a certain cost for a while. So in other words, it's variable cost is not always 1 unit per 1 unit. Sometimes it's at a certain breach of growth, you're going to need more real estate. And this is kind of showing a variable cost kind of like in a step type of process, showing you how much fixed cost goes up depending on your growth and production. So the next big thing that we're looking to go over is actually estimating costs, cost behavioral patterns. So one of the methods that we look over in this situation is essentially estimating the variable rate, and it depends. Of course, each month we're making, say, different amounts of units, but if we look at the high amount and the low amount, and we look at the high activity, low activity, for cost and units, we can kind of come up with basically a normalized cost. And this is 0.25 per unit. We end up saying, hey, it's $3,000 per about 12,000 units. And we're saying that's almost like an average sort of. So during the months of January through June, this is the utility cost that was incurred. And we can kind of estimate on it per unit. Of course, we could also take the average units produced and the average utility cost and streamline it, but basically trying to come up with a variable cost regarding utilities. Um, and that's essentially what we're talking about. 18,000 units, so let's say the total variable cost is 18,000 units times 0.25, so 4,500, and total cost. So we're kind of coming back to the fixed cost. Now, if we have a total cost and we know the variable cost, we can basically derive the variable cost. This is the what's coming behind here. Now, for the next couple of slides, what we look at is we're trying to basically come up at looking at things in terms of a contribution margin. What is the contribution margin when we look at an income statement? And this is kind of looking at a cost structure and trying to see, hey, after variable expenses, how much do we have? And that's called contribution margin, as opposed to before we had gross profit. Contribution margin is basically how much do you have to contribute to fixed costs. And then operating income is the contribution margin less the fixed expenses. So let's look at that one more time. This is basically something to know. That is the big piece from this. Revenues less variable expenses goes to contribution margin. Contribution margin is showing us how much we have to dedicate to fixed expenses. So if you think about Nikes, we had revenues. Now we're talking about, hey, what is the sales commission, labor, manufacturing kind of cost, material cost. That's all variable expense, less contribution margin. What about management salaries? What about the rent on the factory? Things like that. And then we have operating income, and that's something that, of course, is closer to net income, but that is basically income after operations. That is available now. So if we're going to look more into forming our little income state margin, contribution margin statement, this is how we look at it. And then we can have an example here that I want to focus on is where we look at selling price per case, variable cost per unit, total fixed expenses, sales volume. So we say, hey, say we making 15 bucks per unit, variable expenses is 9, so we're basically having $6 of contribution per unit. We got 8,000 of these things out there, 48,000, boom. That is going to be basically the 48,000 is going to be what's available. Now fixed expenses is 40, so we know that. So contribution margin is 48,000, and we're looking at an 8,000 of income. So this way we can actually play around with units. So you could see, hey, how many units do I need to produce in order to break even after my fixed expenses? How many units do I need to produce in order to make a certain profit? So this kind of model, I think, is actually in fashion, probably is very much used a lot, although I'm sure a lot of the stuff in fashion happens in batches. But this is really something to play with. Think about this, like how many units do you need to produce to basically cover your fixed expenses and then make some profit. And I'm sure this comes up a lot in various models and various batches and production runs, and is almost probably worked out to an art in the fashion world. But this is essentially as far as I want to take you guys. Please review this chapter and go through this a couple of times. But this is where I want you guys to be, to play around with the different scenarios to see where we end up based on units, and how would you decide on essentially how many units to produce in order to come up to a certain number to cover your fixed costs. And that's where we will focus this week.